Nyla Robinson stood in the shadows of the grand ballroom, her fingers gripping the cold edges of a silver tray until her knuckles turned ashen. The weight wasn't just the champagne, it was the crushing gravity of a fallen life. Only 14 months ago, she had walked through these same halls as the daughter of the house, her heels clicking against the marble with the rhythm of a girl who knew the world was hers for the taking. Her father, Marcus Robinson, had been a titan of industry, a man whose laughter could fill a room and whose integrity was the bedrock of their family. She remembered the way he would lift her onto his shoulders when she was small, promising her that one day she would build her own empire. He had taught her about honor, about standing tall even when the world pushed back. But when the heart attack took him on a rainy Tuesday in March, the vultures didn't just circle, they moved in with surgical precision. Her stepmother, Evelyn, had been a master of the long game. The woman had married Marcus only 3 years prior, bringing with her a daughter from a previous marriage, Claire, who was 2 years younger than Nyla but infinitely more cunning. Evelyn had played the role of grieving widow with Oscar-worthy performance, dabbing at dry eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs, while her lawyers worked in the background like termites through wood. Within weeks of the funeral, the lost wills appeared. The forged signatures were validated by crooked lawyers who had been paid handsomely for their moral flexibility. And Nyla found herself standing on the sidewalk of her own home with nothing but a single suitcase and her dignity. The cars, the Robinson estate with its sprawling gardens and library that smelled of leather and her father's cologne, the multi-million-dollar inheritance that was supposed to fund her education and future. All of it was funneled into the hands of Evelyn and Claire with the efficiency of a well-planned heist. Nyla had spent the last year in a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the city, where the pipes rattled and the neighbors fought at 3 in the morning. She worked 3 jobs to pay for her late mother's lingering medical debts and the legal fees from her failed attempt to contest the will. She served coffee at dawn, filed papers at a law office during the day, and cleaned office buildings at night. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were now rough and scarred. Her back ached constantly. She had lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose, and her reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed and haunted. Meanwhile, Claire used Nyla's stolen fortune to fund a wedding that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The invitations alone were gilded works of art. The dress was custom-designed in Paris. The flowers were flown in from 5 different countries. And in a final twist of the knife, Evelyn had called Nyla 2 weeks before the wedding with an offer she couldn't refuse. What happened next? I need you to see it for yourself. Before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. We need extra staff, Evelyn had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. You could use the money, couldn't you, dear? Nyla had wanted to refuse. She had wanted to tell Evelyn exactly where she could shove her job offer. But the rent was due, and her landlord had already threatened eviction twice. So she swallowed her pride, choked down the bile rising in her throat, and said yes. Now Nyla is back. Not as a guest, but as staff member 14. She wore a stiff, scratchy maid's uniform that felt like a mockery of her heritage and her history. Every muscle in her body screamed from a week of double shifts, yet she kept her chin parallel to the floor. She watched from the periphery as the people she had grown up with, the debutantes she had shared tea with at country clubs, the heirs who had once begged for her attention at charity galas laughed and drank, their eyes sliding right over her as though she were part of the furniture. To them, she had become invisible, a ghost in a black dress serving their celebration. The air in the ballroom was a suffocating blend of expensive lilies, heavy perfume, and the sharp, ozone scent of a coming storm brewing outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The music was a rehearsed symphony of strings, intended to signal the height of elegance. 200 guests filled the space, their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos a sea of wealth that seemed to mock Nyla with every step she took. She moved through the crowd with a practiced, silent grace, her eyes focused on the task. She had learned quickly that the key to survival was to become a shadow, present but not seen, helpful but not acknowledged. She reached a cluster of guests near the head table, where Claire stood like a vision of white lace and malice. The bride's dress probably cost more than Nyla would earn in 5 years. Diamonds sparkled at her throat, diamonds that had belonged to Nyla's grandmother. As Nyla leaned in to offer a fresh flute of vintage champagne to a guest, she saw Claire's eyes lock onto hers. There was no sisterly warmth, only a jagged, predatory glee that made Nyla's stomach turn. She had seen that look before, when they were teenagers and Claire would accidentally spill things on Nyla's homework, when Claire would whisper lies to their father about Nyla breaking his rules, when Claire would smile sweetly while sabotaging Nyla behind the scenes. "Careful now," Claire whispered, her voice low enough that only Nyla could hear over the music and chatter. "We wouldn't want the help making a scene." Before Nyla could pull back, Claire's silk-shod foot darted out with practiced precision, hooking behind Nyla's ankle. Nyla's center of gravity vanished. The silver tray tilted, and for a split second, time seemed to liquefy. She saw the champagne flute sliding, saw the amber liquid catching the light of the chandeliers, saw the horror of what was about to happen reflected in a dozen pairs of eyes. Then came the crash, a violent, glass-shattering explosion that sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous room. The music died mid-note, the violinists bow screeching to a halt. A dozen crystal flutes lay in jagged shards across the white marble, the pale gold liquid spreading like a stain across the pristine floor. The champagne soaked into the hem of Nyla's uniform, the cold seeping through to her skin. She stood at the center of the disaster, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to break free. The silence was more painful than the crash, more cutting than the glass. "Oh, Nyla," Claire cried out, her voice suddenly loud and performatively shocked, carrying to every corner of the ballroom. She pressed a hand to her chest as though wounded. "I know you're bitter about your father's failures, but must you ruin my special day? I tried to be kind by giving you a job when no one else would hire you, but I suppose some people just weren't born to handle fine things." The whispers began instantly, a low hiss of judgment that spread through the crowd like poison through water. "Isn't that the Robinson girl? How pathetic." From the penthouse to the pantry. "I heard she's desperate. Living in some slum across town. I always knew Marcus was living beyond his means. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The laughter followed, led by Claire's bridesmaids, a cruel, melodic sound that stripped Nyla of the last of her composure. These were women she had considered friends once. They had studied together, shopped together, shared secrets over late-night phone calls. Now they laughed at her downfall as though it were entertainment designed for their amusement. She felt the heat of humiliation rising in her chest, a thick, suffocating wave that threatened to drown her. She wanted to run, to vanish into the shadows and never return, but her feet felt as though they had been fused to the marble. She was trapped in this moment, displayed for their mockery like an animal in a zoo. Nyla knelt down to pick up the shards, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely grasp the pieces. As she reached for a large fragment of glass, the sharp edge sliced deep into her palm. The pain was bright and immediate, but she didn't cry out. She had learned over this past year that crying only gave people more satisfaction. She watched the dark red blood mingle with the champagne on the floor, a silent testament to her pain. No one offered a hand. No one offered a napkin or a word of comfort. They just watched the fallen princess bleed, their faces a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Evelyn stood near the bride's table, her lips curved in the faintest smile, as though this were exactly the outcome she had orchestrated. Nyla gathered the shards piece by piece, her vision blurring with unshed tears, her blood leaving crimson smears on the white marble. The atmosphere in the room shifted with the suddenness of a temperature drop, as though winter had suddenly invaded the space. The heavy, gold-leafed double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with force, hitting the walls with a dull thud that silenced even the whispers. A man stepped into the light, and the air seemed to flee the lungs of every guest. Lee Sung-hyuk did not walk. He moved with the lethal, unhurried grace of an apex predator surveying its territory. He was draped in a black tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light of the chandeliers, tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. His face was angular and sharp, all hard lines and dangerous beauty. His hair was swept back, revealing a face that could have been carved from marble, cold, perfect, and utterly intimidating. As the head of the Lee Syndicate, his name was a whisper of fear in the city's boardrooms and a roar of authority in its shadows. He controlled shipping, real estate, half the politicians in the state, and more than a few judges. He was a man who didn't attend weddings. He was a man who decided whether weddings were allowed to happen at all. Rumor had it he had once shut down an entire wedding reception because the groom had defaulted on a loan. Another rumor claimed he had bought out a five-star hotel just to evict a business rival from a board meeting. He walked past the shocked bride, past the stuttering groom who looked like he might faint, and past the rows of elite guests who scrambled to give him a wide berth as though he carried an invisible force field of danger. His eyes, dark and as cold as deep-sea water, were fixed solely on the woman on her knees. The silence was now absolute, so heavy it was deafening. Nyla could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She looked up from the shards of glass, her bleeding hand pressed against her uniform, and found herself staring into eyes that seemed to see straight through her, past the uniform, past the humiliation, past the broken girl on the floor, to something deeper. He stopped directly in front of her. He didn't look at the mess. He didn't look at the shattered glass or the spreading stain of champagne and blood. He reached down with a hand that was surprisingly gentle and took Nyla's injured hand in his touch warm against her cold skin. Slowly, deliberately, as though he had all the time in the world and this ballroom full of witnesses was irrelevant, he pulled her to her feet. The entire room gasped, a collective inhale of shock that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the space. The most feared man in the country, a man who had never been seen bowing to anyone, who made politicians and CEOs tremble with a single glance, bowed his head. He didn't just bow, he performed the deep, respectful greeting reserved for royalty or revered elders, the kind of bow that acknowledged someone as an equal or superior. Then, he raised her hand and pressed a slow, lingering kiss to her bleeding knuckles, his lips warm against her skin. The gesture was so intimate, so deliberate, so publicly defiant of every social norm that several guests actually stumbled backward. "The dragon recognizes its own," he said, his voice a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards and the chandeliers overhead. His accent carried the weight of his Korean heritage, precise and controlled. He finally turned his gaze to Claire, and the bride visibly recoiled, her face draining of color. The sheer, icy violence in his expression was enough to make grown men look away. "And you," he said to Claire, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that somehow carried through the entire ballroom, "are standing on the property of a queen you are not fit to serve. I will remember this display of hospitality." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Claire's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, all her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist under a scorching sun. Evelyn, for the first time since Nyla had known her, looked genuinely afraid. Sung-hyuk turned back to Nyla, his expression softening by a fraction, a change so subtle only she could see it, like a crack appearing in ice. "You have served enough for one lifetime," he murmured, his voice now meant only for her. "It is time you were served." Without waiting for a response, without asking permission or explaining his actions, he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm with the care one might use handling precious silk. Nyla walked beside him on unsteady legs, her head held high through sheer force of will, leaving behind the shards of her past and the stunned silence of the people who thought they had broken her. As they passed through the golden doors, Nyla caught one final glimpse of Claire's face, pale with fury and disbelief. And for the first time in 14 months, Nyla felt something other than despair. She felt the stirring of hope. The interior of Lee Sung-hyuk's car was a sanctuary of blackened glass and scentless leather. Nyla sat stiffly in the back seat, her injured hand now wrapped in a clean silk handkerchief he had provided without a word. The fabric was embroidered with his initials in silver thread LSH. It should have stopped bleeding by now, but her heart was still racing, adrenaline flooding her system. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the gravity of what had just occurred. For a year, Nyla had been invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of her former life. But in one night, in the span of perhaps 5 minutes, she had been thrust into the center of a storm by the city's most dangerous man. Outside the windows, the city lights streaked past in a blur of neon and shadow. They were heading away from the wealthy district where the wedding had been held, away from the world Nyla had once known. She watched her reflection in the dark glass, hollow-eyed, disheveled, still wearing the hated uniform, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by not running the moment she had the chance. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking from disuse and emotion. "Why would someone like you risk your reputation for a server at a wedding?" Sung-hyuk didn't look at her immediately. He sat with perfect posture, his hands folded in his lap, his profile as sharp and beautiful as a knife's edge against the city lights. When he finally spoke, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because years ago, I was the one everyone laughed at," he said, his voice carrying a weight of memory that made Nyla turn to look at him fully. "I came to this country with nothing. I was a scholarship student among the elite, the son of immigrants who worked 16-hour days so I could attend a private academy. The other students made sure I knew I didn't belong. They made sure I knew my place." He turned to her then, his dark eyes reflecting the passing lights of the city, and she saw something she hadn't expected: pain, old but not forgotten, like a scar that ached in cold weather. "I know that look in your eyes," he continued. "I've seen it in the mirror. The look of someone who has been stripped of everything they thought defined them, who has been told they are worthless so many times they've almost started to believe it." He paused, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "A single moment of kindness from a stranger once changed my life. A teacher who saw past my worn shoes and second-hand uniform, who believed I was capable of more. Tonight, I was merely repaying a debt to the world." Nyla felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She had cried enough this year. "I don't need pity," she said, trying to inject strength into her voice and failing. "Good," Sung-hyuk replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Because I'm not offering pity. I'm offering a restart." When they arrived at his estate, Nyla's breath caught in her throat. It was a fortress of modern architecture and high security, all clean lines and intimidating beauty. Guards stood at the gates, their faces impassive as the car passed through. The building itself was a study in contrasts: harsh angular concrete softened by warm interior lights, defensive walls made beautiful by strategic landscaping. He led her not to a guest room, but to a massive office lined with screens displaying real-time data and security feeds, and shelves filled with folders and leather-bound books. The desk was carved from a single piece of dark wood, polished to a mirror shine. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city sprawling below, like a constellation of earthbound stars. He didn't offer her a seat as a guest. He pulled out the chair across from his desk, a position of equality, of partnership, and waited until she sat. "I am not offering pity," he repeated, his voice firm, brooking no argument. "I'm offering a restart. You can walk away right now, return to your life, and forget this night ever happened. Or you can stay, and I will give you the tools to rebuild everything they took from you." Nyla stared at him, searching his face for any hint of deception, any trace of the ulterior motives she had learned to expect from people. But there was only intensity, only a fierce kind of honor that reminded her, achingly, of her father. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The catch," he said, leaning forward, "is that you'll have to work harder than you've ever worked in your life. Harder than those 3 jobs you're currently juggling. You'll have to learn things that will make you uncomfortable. You'll have to become someone stronger than the girl who walked into that ballroom tonight." He paused, and his eyes held hers. "And if you fail, and you might, I expect you to fail forward. Learn from it. Get up. Try again." For the first time in 14 months, Nyla felt something kindle in her chest. Not hope exactly, hope was still too fragile, too easily crushed. But determination. The same determination that had gotten her through this past year, now given direction and purpose. "I won't fail," she said, and she almost believed it. Sung-hyuk smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from intimidating to almost warm. Good. Because neither will I. The transition from servant to strategist was not a gift, but a conquest. Nyla was placed within the foundation of Sung-hyuk's empire, a program designed to help those who had suffered financial or emotional collapse rebuild their lives. It was called the Phoenix Initiative, and it was the legitimate face of his organization, the shield that protected the sword. It was supposed to be a small administrative role, something to get her on her feet while she figured out her next move. But Nyla's brilliance, long suppressed by her stepfamily's cruelty and her own crushing circumstances, surged to the surface like water breaching a dam. Within weeks, she wasn't just filing papers and answering phones. She was managing outreach programs, coordinating with legal aid organizations, and handling projects that required surgical precision and empathetic understanding. She created a database system that streamlined intake processes, reducing wait times for desperate people by 70%. She developed partnerships with local businesses to create job pipelines for program participants. She wrote grants that brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars in funding. Her kindness was contagious, bringing warmth to a space that often felt cold and transactional. She remembered what it felt like to be desperate, to be invisible, to be judged without mercy. She treated every person who walked through the foundation's doors with the dignity she had been denied, and it showed. Testimonials poured in. Success rates soared. The local news ran a story about the Phoenix Initiative's transformation, though they didn't yet know about Nyla's central role. She worked late into the nights, surrounded by coffee cups and folders, driven by a refusal to quit that bordered on obsessiveness. Her body still ached from the physical labor of her previous jobs, but now her mind was engaged, alive, burning bright. She was rebuilding herself piece by piece, day by day, decision by decision. Sung-hyuk watched her from a distance, admiring her resilience while giving her space to grow. He would sometimes appear in the foundation offices late at night, his jacket discarded, his tie loosened, looking less like a mafia boss and more like a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. One evening, he found her still at her desk at midnight, her eyes red from staring at computer screens, her third cup of coffee growing cold beside her keyboard. She was reviewing case files, making notes about families who needed additional support. "You don't have to fix the whole world in one night," he said gently, appearing in her doorway like a shadow given form. She looked up, startled, and then smiled tiredly. "Maybe not," she replied, "but I can start with one person." And then another. And another. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside, the mafia, the wedding, the stolen inheritance, the public scrutiny, faded away. It wasn't a moment of fireworks or dramatic revelation. It was quieter than that, more profound. It was two wounded souls finding strength in one another, recognizing a kindred spirit in the darkness. "Your father would be proud," Sung-hyuk said softly, and Nyla felt tears spring to her eyes. "I hope so," she whispered. He walked to her desk and gently closed her laptop. "Go home. Rest. The world will still need saving tomorrow." For the first time in as long as she could remember, Nyla laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The peace was short-lived. One morning, exactly 6 weeks after the wedding, Nyla woke up to her phone vibrating violently on her nightstand. She grabbed it groggily, expecting maybe a work email or a message from one of the foundation's clients. Instead, her screen was filled with notifications, hundreds of them, thousands of them, multiplying by the second like digital locusts. She opened her social media and felt her stomach drop through the floor. Her face was everywhere. Photos of her leaving Sung-hyuk's estate, of them in his car, of her at the foundation offices. Someone had been following them, documenting their every move. The headlines were brutal. Mafia boss's mystery woman revealed, from servant to seductress. The calculated rise of Nyla Robinson. Did she orchestrate her own humiliation? And leading the charge, giving interview after interview on national television, was Claire Robinson. Nyla watched in horror as her stepsister appeared on morning shows, wearing designer clothes bought with Nyla's stolen money, her face arranged in an expression of faux sympathy that made Nyla want to scream. "I'm just so worried about her," Claire said to a sympathetic host, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Nyla has always been strategic. Even as children, she knew how to position herself to get what she wanted. When our father died and the truth about his debts came out, she refused to accept that the money was gone. She always believed she owed something. The host leaned forward conspiratorially. "Are you suggesting she planned what happened at your wedding?" Claire paused, as though considering her words carefully, though Nyla knew this was all rehearsed. "I don't want to accuse anyone of anything." But she knew Lee Sung-hyuk would be there. She knew he had a reputation for taking interest in people he sees as underdogs. Is it really so hard to believe she saw an opportunity and took it? The interview went viral within hours. The online hate was brutal and immediate. Comment sections filled with vitriol. "Gold digger trash, she played everyone like a violin mafia whore. She probably tripped herself on purpose." Nyla stopped going to work, calling in sick for the first time since she'd started. She retreated into the guest wing of Sung-hyuk's estate, refusing to answer calls, refusing to look at her phone, refusing to face a world that had decided who she was without ever knowing her story. She felt the old sting of humiliation return, the echoes of the ballroom laughter ringing in her ears. She felt like she would never be seen as more than the girl from the wedding, the fallen princess, the opportunist who slept her way to salvation. On the third day of her self-imposed isolation, Sung-hyuk appeared at her door carrying takeout containers from her favorite Thai restaurant and a quiet, unshakable confidence that seemed to fill the room. "You can't hide forever," he said softly, setting the food on the table and sitting across from her. "People don't get to decide your worth." "They already have," Nyla said bitterly, pulling her knees to her chest. "You saw what they're saying. Claire has convinced everyone that I'm exactly what they always suspected, a con artist, a gold digger, a woman who survived," Sung-hyuk interrupted firmly. "A woman who was knocked down and got back up. A woman who turned a nightmare into an opportunity, not through manipulation, but through competence and compassion." "That's not what they see." "Then show them what you are," he challenged. "Not through anger, but through grace. Tell your story. Let them see you as you actually are, not as Claire wants them to see you." "They won't listen." "Then make them listen." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I have watched you transform the lives of hundreds of people in 6 weeks. I have watched you work until you can barely stand, driven not by greed, but by a desperate need to help others avoid the pain you've endured. I have watched you be kind when the world has given you every reason to be cruel." His eyes held hers, intense and unwavering. "If you hide now, Claire wins. She gets to define you forever. Is that what you want?" Nyla felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock. She thought about her father, about the man who had taught her to stand tall even when the world pushed back. She thought about the families at the Phoenix Initiative who looked at her with hope and trust. She thought about the girl she had been at that wedding, broken, bleeding, humiliated, and the woman she had become in the weeks since. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "That's not what I want." "Then let's go to war," Sung-hyuk said with a fierce smile. "But we'll do it your way. With truth and grace as our weapons." 1 week later, Nyla did the unthinkable. She didn't hire a PR firm. She didn't craft a carefully worded statement released through lawyers. Instead, she walked into a press conference wearing a simple navy blue dress and her father's watch, facing a room full of cameras and reporters who expected her to crumble. She stood at the podium, her hands steady on either side of the microphone, and looked directly into the cameras. Behind those lenses were millions of people, most of whom had already decided she was guilty. But she also knew that somewhere in that massive audience were people like her, people who had been knocked down, stripped of everything, told they were worthless. "My name is Nyla Robinson," she began, her voice clear and strong, "and I want to tell you a story." She told them about her father, about his integrity and his love. She told them about the heart attack, about the forged will, about being thrown out of her own home. She told them about the 3 jobs, the medical debts, the humiliation of serving at her stepsister's wedding. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth in a voice that didn't waver. When Claire tripped me and I fell, Nyla continued, I didn't see an opportunity. I saw the end. I saw myself on that floor surrounded by broken glass and the laughter of people I once called friends, and I thought, this is it. This is how my story ends. She paused, letting the silence stretch for a heartbeat. But then Lee Sung-hyuk did something no one expected. He saw me. Not as a servant, not as a fallen socialite, not as an opportunity. He saw me as a person who deserved dignity. She smiled slightly, and her eyes softened. He didn't save me. Let me be very clear about that. He reminded me that I could stand again. He gave me a chance to save myself. She went on to talk about the Phoenix Initiative, about the work they did, about the hundreds of families they had helped. She showed statistics, shared testimonials, demonstrated the tangible good that had come from her second chance. Dignity isn't given by others, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. It's rebuilt from within. I didn't orchestrate my humiliation for personal gain. I worked through it for personal growth. There's a difference. She looked directly into the main camera. And to anyone out there who has been knocked down, who has been told they're worthless, who thinks their story has ended, it hasn't. You get to write your next chapter. No one else gets that pen. The clip went viral within an hour. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was real. Millions of people shared it, hailing her as a voice of resilience. The hashtag Write Your Chapter trended worldwide. Support flooded in from people who had faced similar circumstances, from domestic violence survivors to bankruptcy victims to anyone who had ever felt invisible. The narrative shifted. Claire's interviews were suddenly being scrutinized. People dug into the Robinson will case, found the irregularities, and questioned the convenient timing. Journalists who had initially painted Nyla as a villain began publishing deeper investigations. The truth, slowly but inevitably, came to light. That night, in the quiet of Sung-hyuk's study, he found Nyla standing by the windows, looking out over the city. He came to stand beside her, their reflections side by side in the glass. You changed how people see strength today, he said quietly. And you changed me. She turned to look at him, questions in her eyes. I've spent years building walls, he continued. Being feared, being untouchable. But you showed that there's more strength in vulnerability and honesty than in all my carefully constructed armor. He took her hand. Thank you. Nyla squeezed his hand, feeling something warm and bright settling in her chest. Thank you for believing I could stand. I always knew you could, he replied. I was just waiting for you to remember. 1 year after the shattered glass of the wedding, the Grand Monarch Hotel, the same venue where Nyla had bled on the marble, hosted another gala. The chandeliers shimmered as they had before, the same orchestra played, the same elite crowd filled the ballroom. But this time, everything was different. This time, Nyla Robinson didn't enter through the service door. She stood on the stage as the director of the Phoenix Initiative, wearing an emerald dress that had been her mother's, her father's watch gleaming on her wrist. She was speaking to an audience of hundreds, including the very elite who had once mocked her, many of whom now wouldn't meet her eyes. A year ago, I was humiliated here, she said, her voice steady and commanding, carrying through the ballroom without need for amplification. I knelt on this floor while people laughed. I bled on this marble while people watched. I was at the lowest point of my life. She paused, letting the audience sit with the discomfort of that memory. Today, I stand here not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove what grace can rebuild. She gestured to the screens behind her, which displayed photos and statistics from the Phoenix Initiative's first year. In 12 months, we have helped over 500 families rebuild their lives. We have provided job training, legal assistance, housing support, and, most importantly, dignity to people who thought they had none left. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous crescendo that filled the room. It was a sound that replaced the memory of cruel laughter, a sound that validated everything she had worked for. She saw faces in the crowd, some ashamed, some moved to tears, some simply awestruck. She had reclaimed her name and her legacy, not by taking it back through legal battles or revenge, but by building something entirely new, something better than what had been stolen. As the applause died down, a familiar figure stepped onto the stage, and Nyla's breath caught. Lee Sung-hyuk, who never made public appearances at events like this, who maintained his reputation through calculated absence, walked toward her holding a velvet box. The room fell silent, every phone camera suddenly recording. "Last year," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "I said you were mine." His eyes found hers, and in them she saw everything they had built together, the late nights working, the quiet conversations, the mutual respect that had slowly transformed into something deeper. "Tonight, I'll say it again, but not as protection, as a partnership." He knelt before her in the same spot where she had once bled on the marble, in the same room where she had been broken. But this time, he knelt not out of pity, but out of reverence. He opened the velvet box, revealing a ring that caught the light of the chandeliers, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds, the same color as her mother's favorite dress. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady despite the hundreds of witnesses, despite the cameras, despite the weight of the moment. Tears streamed down Nyla's face, not tears of pain or humiliation this time, but tears of joy so pure it felt like sunlight flooding her veins. She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion choking her throat, and finally managed yes. 1,000 times yes. The ballroom that had once witnessed her destruction now witnessed her rebirth. It was a poetic ending to a year of struggle, a moment where the broken shards were finally assembled into a crown. 5 years later, Nyla Robinson Lee ran her own foundation with branches in 12 cities. The Phoenix Initiative had helped thousands of families, changed countless lives, and had become a model for similar programs around the world. She and Sung-hyuk lived quietly despite their public profiles, their lives defined not by the violence of the mafia world or the superficiality of high society, but by the simple, profound work of helping others find their dignity again. They had 2 children, a daughter named Grace and a son named Marcus, after her father. Their home was filled with laughter and love, a sanctuary they had built together from the ashes of their separate traumas. Sung-hyuk had gradually shifted his business interests toward legitimate enterprises, his reputation transforming from feared crime boss to respected businessman and philanthropist. It was a slow process, one that took years of careful maneuvering and strategic exits, but Nyla's influence had shown him there was more than one way to build an empire. Claire and Evelyn had faded into obscurity after a series of legal investigations into the forged will led to fraud charges. They had settled out of court, returning a portion of Marcus Robinson's estate to Nyla, though by then she no longer needed the money. She used it to establish a scholarship fund in her father's name for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, a legacy he would have loved. In her final speech as a world-renowned leader at an international conference on economic justice, Nyla looked out at a new generation of survivors, her face lined with laugh lines and the confident bearing of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. "He didn't rescue me," she told them, echoing the truth she had lived and taught for years. "He walked beside me while I rescued myself." That's what real love does. It doesn't diminish your strength by saving you. It amplifies your strength by believing in you. She paused, her eyes scanning the audience of thousands, seeing her younger self in so many faces. Sometimes, being stripped of everything isn't meant to destroy you. It's meant to show you what you're truly made of. She smiled, thinking of that night in the ballroom, of the shattered glass and the blood and the moment everything changed. "I learned that I'm made of the same thing my father was made of: integrity, resilience, and an unbreakable belief that kindness is not weakness. It's the strongest thing we have." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Backstage, Sung-hyuk waited with their children, Grace holding a bouquet of lilies, not the expensive kind from the wedding, but simple wildflowers she had picked herself. "You were amazing, Mama," Grace said, wrapping her small arms around Nyla's waist. "Yeah, you made people cry," Marcus added, always the practical one. Nyla laughed and pulled them both close, feeling Sung-hyuk's arm come around all of them. This was what victory looked like, not the destruction of her enemies, not the reclamation of stolen wealth, not even the public vindication, though that had been sweet. Victory was this quiet moment with the people she loved, knowing that she had taken her broken pieces and built something beautiful. Knowing that somewhere out there, someone who felt as lost as she once had would hear her story and find the strength to stand. That night, as they drove home through the city lights, Grace asleep against her shoulder and Marcus chattering about his soccer game, Nyla caught Sung-hyuk's eye in the rearview mirror. He smiled at her, that private smile that was hers alone, and she smiled back. She thought about the girl who had knelt in the shattered glass, bleeding and humiliated, certain her story had ended. She wished she could reach back through time and tell that girl what was coming, the pain, yes, but also the growth. The struggle, yes, but also the triumph. The moments of despair, yes, but also the moments of joy so pure they made everything worthwhile. She would tell her, hold on, stand up, write your next chapter, because your story is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. And she would tell her the most important truth she had learned. Sometimes the most beautiful crowns are forged from shattered glass, and the strongest foundations are built on broken ground. The girl who fell became the woman who rose. And in rising, she lifted countless others with her. That was the real redemption. That was the real victory. That was Grace.